Welcome to Nonprofit Fundamentals, Grant Writing, Preparing Grants from Scratch. We have Mark Goldstein with us here today. He is the founder of Communication Mark, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about grant writing, give us some information maybe we haven't seen before, which is always exciting. And I will turn it over to Mark for his introduction.
Thanks, Kathy. Thanks for having me here today. And I'm looking forward to talking with you all. And I'll just say, first of all, if you have questions as I go, please feel free to jump in and just unmute and ask or type it in the chat box. And Kathy, if you could please just let me know if there's something in the chat box that I'm not noticing or seeing, if you want to prompt me. Thank you very much. So my name is Mark Goldstein, as you see on the screen there, and I'll just give you just a little bit of background about myself. I'm a CFRE and a GPC, as you see on the screen there. And what does that mean? It's a certified fundraising executive, which is sort of an all-around qualification for fundraising in all kinds of fundraising. And then I recently decided to get my GPC, which is Grant Professional Certified, and it's an exam basically to show that you know your stuff with grant writing, and it's as the grant writing profession grows, it's starting to adopt more certifications and that sort of thing. And so I wanted to go ahead and get that and see what that process was like. I've my team and I've got a team now we'll have been going for 25 years in the spring, believe it or not, Sarah. And and we've now raised a little over $100 million as a group. Yay! And and they've been not just large grants, but a lot of that is represented by large grants, but a lot of $5,000 grants and $20,000 grants, and a lot of much smaller grants than seven-figure grants. And so we work with small organizations, large organizations. We work with organizations that do all kinds of things. As Kathy was saying earlier, sometimes they're nonprofits, a lot of times they're nonprofits. Sometimes they're municipalities and even for-profits that are doing things for charities or helping charities raise money to utilize their services. So like, for instance, I've worked before for Polycom, which is the big intercom company. Whenever you go and you sit in a conference room and there's that little oddly shaped object in the middle that you talk into, a lot of times that's Polycom. And wrote a little bit for them, writing distance learning and telemedicine grants so that organizations could get grants of for 400, $500,000 to do telemedicine and be able to use that equipment. So that's a little bit about my professional experience and and background. And so Oh, and I should mention too, I'm also currently president of the Grant Professionals Association of North Carolina, the North Carolina chapter of that international organization. And if you're looking for a resource, of course, I'm biased because I'm very active with GPA, with Grant Professionals Association, but I highly recommend it. It's a way to connect with other people who are writing grants all the time. And there's plenty of free instruction after you join that's on the website. And I think some even before you join, perhaps. And just a lot of different resources for grant writers. There's a thing called Grant Zone where you can type in comments and get questions on the fly from grant writers all over the country about pretty much anything. And so, like Sarah, I forget if there's an arts group. I think there might be, but there's a lot of specialized groups like that. And there's always discussions that are happening really actively for all those threads about just questions that people have. So so if you do want to join, if you just Google Grant Professionals Association, it'll come right up. And there's a lot more information on the site about what the benefits are and that kind of thing. But starting up here, so One thing that I wanted to just say is to share our success rate, and I'm doing that not to show off, maybe a little bit to show off, but not very much to show off. But we usually have about a 70% success rate during the year, which I'm very pleased with because I think we want to have a good success rate. We shouldn't probably have a perfect success rate because then we probably means we're not really reaching far enough with a lot of organizations that we work with and trying to get some that are harder to get and that kind of thing. But the main reason I really wanted to share this is because we found even as professional grant writers, we've got a team of about 10 people. And so even being professional grant writers, when we work with more established organizations, like we work with several hospitals and some very established social service organizations and that sort of thing. And then there's on the lower part of the screen, we also work with a lot of organizations that are less developed. They might have been around for a long time, but a lot of them are more inexperienced because they're usually fairly new and unproven. And so this is just to say that even if you do a great job writing grant applications, you're not going to get all the ones that you apply for, and you're a little bit disadvantaged for the first couple years of working on grants if you're a small or sort of a newish organization a lot of the time. It's not always true, but on average, usually we'll get like a 40% success rate or so with those organizations, and more of a 70, like I say, or 80% with ones that are more established. I do want to say every organization I think that we work with thinks that they have something big working against them that means that they can't get grants or that it's really hard for them to get grants. And that might be true, but I just wanted you to know that everybody really has something that's working against them when it comes to grants. So, for instance, like I mentioned, that I work with hospitals sometimes. And so I'll meet with the grassroots organization down the street from the hospital or whatever, and they'll say, I wish that we were like the hospital. Everyone's throwing money at them and everybody sees them out there and gives them money. And then I'll go to a meeting at the hospital and they'll say, boy, everybody thinks we have so much money and we're just made out of money. But, we're worried that that's going to keep us from getting grants because people are going to think that we don't need it or that sort of thing. So there's always something that every organization is working against that usually is a real weakness that you don't necessarily have any control over as well. And so all of this again is just to say that some of your grant writing is going to depend on where you're at and where your organization is at. And feel free again, if you have any questions, feel free to jump in. So I'm going to talk with you a little bit about this 10-step model that I developed, and it's called Open Communication Model. And I just got back from presenting in Denver about this nationally for the first time, and it was really exciting. And I mostly talked about this as a tool, not just to learn grants, but also as a tool to bring other people into the grant process. And so I'm gonna be jumping ahead on a little bit of this, but I'm gonna go through this framework and explain a little bit about why I did this and how this works and how you might use this to help with grant writing. So so this is obviously a 10-step model, and I'm going to start in the top right, in that top right quadrant there. And so I'll start by saying what I often do, which is most organizations mess up this first quadrant. And it's why a lot of organizations don't get funded or don't have really competitive grant proposals, is because they don't spend enough time preparing and planning what they're doing. And they kind of jump right to step 6 over here, which is to send in the application or thereabouts. And so I'm going to talk with you as I go through these steps a little bit about what you should be doing in preparation and then afterwards for applications. And I'm going to give you some tips on how you can strategically prepare and set yourself up better for success. And it doesn't mean that you're going to have perfection with applications, but it should improve your chances if you follow along a system like this. And and Jennifer, you said something about sustainability and grants are they're a little fickle in some ways because they give to new projects mostly. And there's some funders that will give on a continuing basis, and you're very fortunate if you have those funders and they're just going to kind of continue in perpetuity. But for the most part, they want to see something new. It might even be the same program of yours that they're supporting, but they often want to see that they're supporting something new that hasn't happened before that you can innovate on or that you can launch or that you can expand. And so usually the answer for sustainability is I would say is not usually grants. It's a part of that whole funding picture, but it also takes other types of fundraising most often. And I guess the most frequent ones that you hear people talk about are having an annual campaign and asking at least a couple times a year for support from individuals and developing larger donors by continuing to build relationships with the ones who give to you most often or ones that you know have the ability to give more, or coming up with a source of revenue like a thrift shop is a common one that is successful for a lot of organizations that gives you some other form of revenue. And more groups are also getting into gifts, like endowment related gifts or ones that are from donor directed foundations, which are basically ones you can't really apply for. And the donor just decides on their own who to give to. And also, there's a lot of people who are paying more and more attention to end of life gifts too, and having agreements in place with people who are big supporters that they're going to give to you in their will. And so there's all different kinds of fundraising, of course, and I'm not going to talk about all those other kinds beyond that, but I'll just say that usually sustainability, when I see it in other organizations, is when they have a balance of those types of revenue streams and and it is challenging to develop that balance, but that's usually what I see when it comes to organizations that I work with that have that kind of stability. So, any questions about that? Because I know a couple of you had questions about that sustainability piece. And I'm sorry if I just shattered your hopes and dreams by saying that about grants. Because grants are definitely a part of the picture, and it's the most efficient type of fundraising in terms of effort versus reward. But it's not the end all and be all for some of the reasons that I mentioned.
No
Jen?
questions. No
Okay.
questions, just a comment. I'm happy to hear that thrift shops and other avenues are resources because I was interested in doing something like that, but wasn't sure how it would help me.
Okay, yeah. And actually, Asheville Creative Arts, one thing that they do to help with sustainability is they do arts work, but they also provide consulting services, mostly for financials and fundraising to arts organizations and to individual artists. And they have a sort of a sliding scale. So they don't charge at all or very much for the organizations that can't afford it or the individuals who can't afford it. And the ones that can't afford it pay full freight, and that helps to subsidize what they do. And so that's another model, that from what you were saying, Jennifer, that you might want to talk to them about and see how they're doing that. Anything else on the sustainability side? Dr. Cole, did you have anything you want to ask about that? I know you mentioned that as well.
No, Mark, you pretty much answered most of the questions that I would have had. You covered it. We do have a thrift store and we partner with some of the local thrift stores in the area as well. So that does help. They give a certain percentage of donations during certain times of the year, like Thanksgiving and Christmas. We do get donations from them.
Great. Okay, super. So, and Melissa, if you want to jump into, I'm kind of addressing my questions to some of these other folks because when they came on a little earlier, we were talking about their situations and what they're looking for.
So I'm with NC Field, and we're interested in federal grants. We have a couple of contracts with federal, like, sub-granted money or subcontracted money, and then we have a federal sub-grant, but no direct contracts or no direct funds. And then also on our fundraising and just figuring out who our target demographic is because of where we're located. And there's a huge wealth gap where we're located. The wealthiest people are usually agribusinesses or growers, and then we serve their employees. So a lot of the limited English proficient, immigrant, and are primarily engaged in those agribusinesses. So it kind of makes our pool at hand for fundraising a little interesting.
Mhm.
So, we often find ourselves outside of our area when it comes to finding support. So just also looking for, more information and guidance in that way.
Okay. Okay, thank you. And yeah, and when you're in a rural area like that, you've got more chance of getting a federal grant, but less chance of getting a private foundation grant because they're just in a lot of rural areas, there just aren't a lot of those as much as there are in more urban places. But I'm going to go back to what I was talking about originally. I wanted to just address that sustainability question since a couple of you had that before I kind of jumped in more. So going back to this model here that I've got up on the screen. So this top quadrant, as I was mentioning, it's all about planning and getting folks in your group aligned to go after fundraising, to go after grants, or go after other types of funds. And so this first one, invest, is securing leadership endorsement for the process. And so there are a few different things that are involved in that. And this is a more important step than I used to think when I first started to do consulting. And now that I've worked with a lot of different organizations, I see this can really be a really big one, is having a leader who's really bought in and is really confident about having conversations with funders and going after grant opportunities. So for instance, I've had some folks who are leaders of the organizations who they haven't believed quite as much in grant writing, or they've been sort of afraid of sharing too much about what they need or what their weaknesses are, because they're sort of have been trained to not talk about things that are unpleasant to talk about or to share. And so I've had to sort of reassure those folks sometimes that, this is something that is just going to funders. It's not something that's going to be published. It's not something they're going to share with other folks. But it's often important, if you're not the only person at the organization, which you're usually not, even if it's one person shop, you've got a board or something like that. So it's important to make sure that you've got leadership that's involved that really cares about fundraising and is really going to be supportive in that area. And part of that is making sure that the leader understands what you need from them. Like, for instance, showing up to a site visit meeting on time and prepared and being ready to talk just about the application that was submitted and not about 5 other ideas that they had or something like that. It's also just giving them an understanding of how long it takes to go through the grant process, because as I say, it's often something that takes more preparation than just sitting down and writing an application. So please continue to ask some questions if you want in the chat. I see some people had commented, but I'm just leaving it to Kathy to tell me if there's something I should answer there. Otherwise, you can jump in.
They're
But
great. They're just saying, thanks for the information.
okay, great. So on the second step here, assess. So this is where we're starting sometimes when we as a group work with organizations. And it's where you all are often starting when you're getting ready to submit applications, whether it's something that you're conscious of or not. And the way that I define this step is that you're deciding what challenge or need you're going to address that's out in the world and how you're going to address it and either get rid of that problem or help to deal with that problem if it's one that's really going to be around for a long time. And so I'm going to talk in a little bit more about needs and strategies. So I won't go too deep into that right now, but it's just to say that this is a really big piece, again, that a lot of organizations probably don't spend enough time on. Often I'll see in proposals groups that have just kind of jumped right in terms of telling what they're going to do, because that's what a lot of us have been, that's what a lot of us focus on is the day to day, and that's what we know. But remember that when you write these applications, you have to give some room to tell your story and why you're proposing what you're proposing. And that's why pretty much every grant application asks for you to talk about the need and wants you to talk about that piece, because they want to understand, why are you so passionate about what you do? Why is this really important? And why are you proposing to do this? And so if you skip that part of the story, you're really skipping that part that's going to tug at their heartstrings and that's going to fill in a lot of blanks that they have in terms of questions in their heads as they're reading through. So you don't want to skip that piece. And so the next step here is 3, is plan. And so the step 2, it ends when you have a very specific challenge that you decide you're going to go to a grant maker to support. And you've got a strategy that you're confident is going to address the problem. Okay, everybody understanding that piece? That's sort of the definition there of how you know that you're sort of ready to sit down and write a case. So we don't sit down and put a case statement together until we are really super clear on what the problem is and what we think the solution is. You know why we do that? Anybody have a thought on that?
To make
The
sure we're not wasting time and pursuing
Yeah.
the right monies.
Yes, because if these things change, it impacts everything else in the application. If you decide that you're going to address a different problem, you're back at square one, or if you decide that you're going to propose a different strategy, again, it'll change the budget, it'll change all kinds of things. And so like you said, Jennifer, you don't want to waste your time on writing until you really know this is what we want to do. So that's why one reason why that's so important. Once you do decide on those needs and strategies, which again I'll go into this some more in the coming slides here, and then you'll go to this next step, which is plan. Okay, and so this is building your case. And I'll go through the steps of that as we go here. But basically, it's different from writing a grant proposal because it's sort of a catch-all and a white paper, just so you and or other folks in your organization understand what you're wanting to say and making sure that everyone agrees on it. Because a lot of times I see a lot of organizations where everybody thinks that they're going to say that what the other person on their team is going to say. And then when we get it in writing, there's a lot less clarity often than what people originally thought. So people might say, yeah, we're here to build houses. That's our mission. We're going to go out, we're going to build affordable housing. And then when they sit down, they might realize, oh, well, yeah, I thought we were doing it for people with the lowest incomes. And somebody else might say, well, yeah, we're doing it for people with low incomes, but especially people who are people of color. And then somebody else might say, well, I thought we were doing family housing. And you're saying that we're going to do housing for individuals. And so it's really important to get everybody on the same page and make sure that everyone's coming to a consensus about this is how we're going to go forward. And so putting the case together helps to do that. And I'll say more about that soon. So the second quadrant, this is the one that most people are really familiar with if they're doing any kind of grant writing. And so that's the step of prospecting, which is, of course, finding who might give to you, and then the step of cultivation after it. So the prospecting is basically looking before you talk to anybody and just doing your looking on a database online or in the library to see who might fund what we do. And I'll say a little bit more about that as well. But usually that means looking on a database these days, like Foundation Directory Online or Foundation Search or others, Grant Station, ones where you can do some searches and see who gives usually in your geography is usually the biggest one, who's already given to groups in your geography that sort of look like your organization. Um, and and then also what sorts of projects do they give to? So do they give to economic development? Do they give to tourism? What is it exactly that they give to? And so then after you get that research, you're going to this cultivation step of building relationships and learning more. And so often when you do the research, you'll come up with a number of organizations that might fund you. And then you start calling them and start sharing the plan that you already have. And that's important because some want to talk to you pretty much when you know what you're going to ask for, or at least when you have a really solid idea is when most of them want to talk with you about that. They don't want you to just call and say, hey, we do this and how can we get funding so much. They want you to read everything on their website and to have an idea that you're bringing to them is usually the way that that works. Um, and so cultivation is when you're having those discussions and you'll probably learn that some are not going to fund you and others will. And your list is sort of going to change in terms of you might find that the grant makers you're most excited about aren't going to give to you, and then some that you weren't quite as excited about will, or the other way around. And so it's just having those conversations. And Jennifer, to what you were saying earlier about how can I be sure I'm going to get grants or be consistent? This is one of the keys to doing it is doing as much homework as you can before you write the application and finding out from somebody at the foundation if you can, because a lot of them will talk to you and just saying, here's what I'm thinking of asking for, and here's how much I'm going to ask for. And can you tell me, Mrs. Program Officer, does this sound good to you? Is this the sort of project that you fund? Is this a reasonable request? And that sort of thing. So that's the cultivate step. The propose step is simply asking for the funds, and that's usually writing the grant proposal or some other written request. So that's the one that's most obvious. Moving around the wheel here, you've got stewardship next, and that's basically the ones in this category are basically what you're doing after you get the grant. So of course, once you get it, then you have to make sure you're doing well at it, right? Because you're probably not going to get funded again by that funder if you don't. And so you're making sure that you're sort of looking back at what you promised in the grant proposal and that you're implementing. By the way, I should have said this, but you're going to get some handouts afterwards, and it has this diagram in the handouts, and it's going to have all these slides. So I'm sorry I didn't mention that earlier, but you don't have to write every single thing down that you're seeing because you'll get a copy of this. So that's number 7. And then 8 is doing the evaluation. So while you're implementing, tracking and seeing, is this having an impact? And that depends on outcomes. And outcomes are measurable increases in positive change. And so you want to go for qualitative outcomes, not just quantitative. And so when I talk about quantitative, that's like how many, it's usually a number. How many people, how many services are you providing? How many people with low incomes are you helping to better their situation? But it's usually it's and that last one is really an outcome. I kind of skipped ahead on that one, sorry. But the quantitative usually don't tell you if things are getting better. They just sort of talk about the scope. So we're going to serve 50 people. We're going to do 30 workshops and that kind of thing. So you can do 30 workshops and maybe people will get nothing out of it. They probably will, but it doesn't guarantee that that's going to happen. But funders are looking for outcomes that say things like, not only do we know we're going to serve this many people, but 10% are going to buy a home in the next year, or this percentage are going to improve in this certain way. And the more money you're asking for, the more change probably should happen, right? So that's something to think about there in terms of how you're evaluating that you want to have the reviewer of the grant walk away and say, oh, okay, these folks have a plan and they've got something that they're going to do that seems like it's going to work, and they'll be able to measure and really know if it does work. And then you've got number 9 here, reporting, and that's simply just sharing what happened with the funder, even if they don't ask for it. After a year, at the end of the grant, you want to, if not sooner, go back and say, here's what happened. We said that we were going to do X, Y, and Z, and here's what we actually did, and here's what happened. And just letting them know. And you haven't lost if you don't hit all those goals, but funders will want to understand if you didn't succeed in certain areas. They want to know, what lessons did you learn, and why did this happen? What will you do differently the next time to avoid this? And what can we share with other organizations so they won't have this problem, or other towns so they won't have that issue? And then finally, and I'm spending a lot of time on this, I know, and we spent a lot of time before we jumped in, but just the last one on this page, I just wanted to spend the time and go around this because this is one of the most valuable pieces I think I can leave with you. So this last piece is, I call sustain, and it's basically taking stock, usually at the end of the year, maybe it's at the end of your fiscal year, and looking at what you've done, because we tend to just charge forward in our organizations that don't have enough resources, and not really have time to stop and think. And so it's taking a little bit of time and thinking, okay, the arguments that we were making in proposals for the past year, have they changed? Did a massive hurricane happen? Did a pandemic happen? Like what has happened that, either we couldn't see coming or we could see coming, and it had some big impact on our work? And does that thing mean that we need to sort of change the way we're talking to funders, or does it mean that we have to change our services to some extent? And maybe there's more of a need for something now than there was before. And so it's doing that thought process before the grant comes and you have to meet a close deadline. Okay, so any questions there before I move on? I know I just threw a whole lot at you. But wanted to move through that and give you some things to think about. So moving on, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these pieces of preparing the grant application. Like I say, it's a team effort. And so when I presented on this in Denver a week or so ago, I did it in such a way that we talked about, for each one of those steps, what the grant writer actually does. And so sometimes there's this fallacy of thinking that the grant writer is somebody who they're just going to kind of go off in the corner and they're going to write the application and then they'll be done. And there's much more, of course, than the writing of it. And so, for instance, that second step that I talked about with needs and strategies, the person who's doing the grant writing or someone else on their team has to strategize, right? They have to do some research on what the challenge is. They have to do research on what the best approaches are to address those problems. And then when they're getting their leadership involved, like I said, on that first step and trying to do that, you're sort of a cheerleader or you're sort of evangelizing for doing the fundraising. So there's a lot of roles that you play as a grant writer that are not writing. And so at Grant Professionals Association, the grant writer is in some, everybody says it, but usually we try to say grant professionals when we say it, when we do it in writing, because there's so much else that's involved. So you want to pull in people on your line staff when you're describing programs. You want to pull in 1 or 2 representatives of the board. You want to have leadership in your organization. You want to have everybody weighing in on what the best program is to put together, including folks that you work with a lot of the time. So I'm going to talk briefly with you about needs and strategies. And in the handouts, you'll have a fact sheet on each of these that say a lot more and explain this more. But the mistake that I see a lot of organizations make is talking about their own needs, like we need a new staff person or we need a new building. And no matter what you're asking for, even if it's to build your own capacity, not that you don't want to mention those problems, but first and foremost, you always want to mention how the people you serve are going to benefit. And so, for instance, if you need a new staff person, why do you need that new staff person? Is it because you're going to help this many more people improve economic development in the area, and it's going to leverage a lot of other dollars in the community? And that's what you really want to be talking about, right? You want to be talking about here's what's really needed is in our community, we really need more economic development. We really need more tourism. And the way to do it is to provide support to folks in the community, maybe who are doing that work. And so we need to hire somebody to do that. So you always want to lead with that piece of why is this something that is needed out in the community, not inside your own office. And then you can follow up if you need to with talking about that other part. Because when you think about it, needing another person to hire, that's not a need, right? That's a strategy. The strategy is we're going to hire somebody and they're going to give support to people who need support with economic development. And the problem is the lack of development or the lack of money coming into the community, perhaps. Okay, and then in terms of the strategies, that's the approach that you're going to take to meet the challenge. And you want to have some evidence of why this is a good idea. And it could be that it's a best practice. It could be that you've been doing it for years and it works, but you want to be able to tell that story. And so in terms of the needs, they're external to your organization. They're impactful. They're measurable. So it's something that that you'll be able to go back and tell people whether or not what you did worked, because you have sort of a baseline of here's where people are at now and here's where we're going to get to. And so it's important to really think through that challenge and define it as clearly as you can and make sure that it's something that sounds impactful to folks and that can be measured. And in terms of strategies, usually this is a lot simpler once you understand the challenge. It's often really tricky to dig and really define the challenges or the challenge as much as possible. But once you do, you want to have your piece of the proposal that's usually called the project methods. You want to be able to explain how each of those problems are going to be addressed. And so, like, pro tip for your needs section, don't put anything into the needs section other than demographics and general information. Don't put any problems in there that you're not going to solve. or that you're not going to help address, because it's going to just confuse the reader, and they're going to be looking for you to solve that problem if you mention it in your needs statement. It's okay, of course, to say, we're not going to solve poverty, but we live in a low income area, and to talk about those types of demographics and things like that. But you don't want to talk about subjects in a way that's too broad, or that sounds like you're going to take on too much, a larger piece of the problem than you can really handle. I was going to go a little deeper into this, and we're not going to have the time for me to dig that deep, but you'll have all this in your notes, and I'm just going to briefly go through some of these. And so these are key ingredients that you want in both your case statement and in your grant application. And so the case statement, that's that number 3 step, that plan step that I was talking about, where you're making sure everyone is in agreement and you're kind of getting the general plan down on paper. And so, and there's a key difference between writing this case and writing the grant proposal. And the difference is that when you're writing this plan, it's basically to test out all your strategies by getting them in writing and to make sure everyone agrees on the points that you're making. And then you can't really cut and paste this into a grant proposal, because the way that a grant proposal is different is that you have an audience, and you don't have that really with the plan. And so when you write a proposal, you're understanding the audience that you're talking to. It's basically the foundation in this case, and you're looking at what their preferences are and what sort of projects they usually give to. And you're being transparent and sharing the whole idea of what you're asking for. But then the other 90% of your proposal is going to be just talking to them about what they're really concerned with. So for instance, they might be, if they're really concerned about serving people who are Latine, then it might be that 10% of your project serves people who are Latino or Latine, but you're going to talk to them about that 10% and ask them to fund that 10%. They're going to be aware that this is only a part of your program, but the part that they want to know about is just going to be that piece. And so in your case, that Latine piece, it might have been just a small part of your plan, but it's going to be a much bigger part of this particular proposal and what you focus on there. And I'll just, like I say, I'll just go down this list really quickly of the ingredients. So contact information, it sounds really basic, but a lot of people forget to, like, there's funders who get proposals and they don't have a phone number or a name or an email or something because people forget. So it's basic, but you can forget that. The summary, it should be, as it implies, an overview, just a really big general overview. And you don't have to go into detail, but you have to share the main concepts, like those needs and strategies and what exactly you're asking for and how much you're asking for. I know we're getting close to the end here, Kathy, but I'm just kind of going through this last piece just so you know I'm conscious of that. And then you've got your organization and project background. And this is a real clear dividing line, that they just want your organization information. They don't want to know about what you're about to propose. They just want to know, who is your organization? How long have they been around? What do they do? What are their accomplishments? Those kinds of things. And then after that piece, you're really just talking only about the project and not about the organization. And you're kind of making that shift. So the needs statement, it's going to talk about, for this particular project that you're asking for support for, what are the problems that you're addressing? And then the objectives and outcomes, I've mentioned, you're going to have quantitative and qualitative information. So here's how many people we're going to serve, here's where it's going to happen, but here's the measurable impact, that these folks are going to have a certification or a diploma at the end, or they're going to see an improvement in some area. And then you've got the methods of explaining, here's the steps to get there, and the evaluation of, here's how we're going to know if we're successful or not. It's not repeating the objectives, but it's saying, here's who's going to measure, here's how we're going to measure and what we're going to measure, here's the tools that we're going to use, and those sorts of things, just talking about that measurement. And then you've got how you're going to sustain this, which is often being creative, unfortunately. And what parts of our fundraising program are we going to build so that we don't have to ask you for money again, is what they want to know. And then your budget, which should lay out how the income is going to match up with the expenses so that you're covering all of your expenses that you have. And so we have a limited amount of time, so I've gone through all that really quickly, and I think I probably need to stop here, Kathy, because I know we're getting close. And
We
people can
appreciate
reach
it.
out.
That's great.
with
Our folks
questions.
know, they know they can pop on and off as they need to. And like you said, we'll be sending out some more documents when we send out the recording next week. So you'll be able to have all the information that either you missed, we didn't get to, or that you just want to review again.